welcome to our True 78 webinar today, Beyond Digital Distractions to Discipleship. I want to just give you a quick overview. We'll be talking with Clare Morell today, author of The Tech Exit, about the challenges to the discipleship and the spiritual formation of children posed by digital media, including all kinds of screens, social media, the internet, video games. We are so glad that you joined us today, and we'd love to hear from you. So if you have questions during the interview, please write them in the chat box. And then at the end of the time when Steve's interviewing Clare, I'll come back and ask your questions to Clare so you can hear live from her. And now we want to welcome our special guest, author Clare Morell, author of The Tech Exit, a practical guide to freeing kids and teens from smartphones. Welcome, Clare. We're so glad you're here with us today.
I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having me.
It's our pleasure. So Clare is a fellow at the Ethics and Public Policy Center in Washington, D.C., where she directs EPPC's Technology and Human Flourishing Project. Prior to joining EPPC, she worked in the White House Counsel's Office and the Department of Justice, so she really knows her stuff. And we're really thankful to have her here today. And also joining us is Steve Waters, Director of Communications with Truth 78. So Steve is going to take it from here and handle the interview with Clare.
Clare, thanks so much for being with us. We've been looking forward to this time. I know that you have written a very valuable book, and that it's really hitting a nerve. And we've been looking forward to the opportunity to share your message with our audience, but specifically to go a little further beyond general parenting that is affected by our digital age, and to hone in on specific impact in the area of discipleship. But let's begin. I'd love to have your thoughts on how parents have always had to guide their children and how they interact with the world around them and how they manage what's helpful for them and protect them from what's harmful. But what are you seeing in our digital age that's making that even more challenging, that has prompted you to write this book?
Yes, thank you for asking. I think just a couple of things really stand out to me about the digital age. So, the push towards these kind of individualized screens, I think, caught parents really off guard in the sense that it just became kind of part of the culture. And I think even Christian parents kind of thought, well, as long as we're just controlling what kinds of content our kids are accessing on these devices, it's okay. And I think when we actually look at the design of these technologies, even at a deeper level than just the content that could be harmful that kids could come across, we realize that they are designed to be addictive.
Mm.
And anything that's addictive is going to be in direct contrast to what parents are trying to do. We're trying to form a well-formed, disciple of Jesus. And these technologies are really undermining that. They undermine, at the root, parental authority. Because now it becomes this child and the internet becomes their source for all information. They're going to these platforms for advice, for wisdom, instead of going to their parents. And they're starting to trust these outside voices, these influencers being promoted to them online over and above their parents, their parental authority, and the authority of their church, their pastors, these other traditional adult mentors in a child's life. So I think just the medium itself is very dangerous. And I think that's something I try to point out to parents is the medium is the message. The screen exists to serve up constant entertainment and amusement to children. And it starts to teach them that the purpose of life is really for endless scrolling and entertainment. It's all about you. It's all about your self-pleasure and self-expression. And because they're highly individualized via all these algorithms and even the size of the screen, right? The smartphone, the tablet, it starts to feel like it's this individualized experience. And it's then disconnecting them from their real life relationships. So there's lots of more harms we could talk about related to the content, but I think just looking at the design, we have to recognize the technology is not neutral. It is inherently bent towards addiction and isolation and undermining a parent's loving authority in their child's life.
Now, in the past, as new technologies have emerged, they've often been followed by a range of parental controls and ways that parents are able to supervise and guide that experience. How's that different now?
Yeah. So, I mean, a couple things, even from past technologies, even just thinking about, okay, a television or a computer, these are items that stay in the home. And I think every, new device is very transportable. It's customizable. Like they can take it with them 24/7. So I think that is a distinction too from just past technologies. But then with the parental controls piece, unlike a computer browser where you can install a web filter to block pornographic websites on the computer's browser, the smart devices have hundreds and thousands of apps. And
Mm.
every app is its own portal to the internet, has its own in app browser. And often these external filters actually have trouble getting access inside of those apps. They have trouble filtering those in app browsers. And so, what it means is traditional kind of parental controls are very powerless in the face of these smart technologies that, again, they just have thousands of portals of entry to the online world a parent has to be constantly trying to police or stop. Even like within the app stores, parents will often say, I had no idea my child could access or download that app. And so there are just so many pieces to the device. And because of their size, they're very secretive, and it's very difficult for a parent to see in to what a child may be seeing or doing on a smartphone or tablet, different than the way a parent would be in much more ability to kind of control what's on a television in their home, or even control the filters and things on a web browser. So the smart devices, I try to tell parents, are inherently made to be challenging to parental control. And I don't think that that's an accident. I really do think that despite what companies say, they really don't ultimately want parents to be in control because they want to maximize our children's time, attention, and data. And so ultimately, their algorithms are in control of a child's experience, and they want it to be that way.
Do you think that's also a reason why any thoughts about, well, let's just try to limit this to an hour a day or a certain amount of time is also a challenge?
Yes, because I kind of unpack this in my book, but the brain research shows that even a small amount of time on these interactive screens, because of the addictive design, they're highly addictive. The effects are
Mm.
not just limited to that small amount of time because kids actually kind of carry the virtual world with them long after they leave it. Because of the different design elements, the metrics, I mean, a child can think for hours after they log off Instagram, what new likes may they have gotten, what followers,
Mm.
might they have gained, and also what are they missing out on? What are people posting that they're not seeing? And so because of these, they get these constant dopamine hits, even in that 10 to 15 minutes on an app or device, it creates this constant craving for more. And so as soon as they log off, their brain actually plunges into this dopamine deficit state, which creates this strong kind of constant craving to go back on. And it desensitizes them also to pleasures in the real world. Now their brain is not at homeostasis. It's gone into this deficit. So even real life pleasures and experiences don't feel pleasurable. And so there are really these brain level effects are happening even if children are on it for a short amount of time. And so that's why I think the screen time limit has just been really a misnomer for parents. Like I think there's been this kind of myth that we can just by limiting the amount of time limit the damage. And while, certainly excessive amounts of time online would be far worse to a child, even in small amounts, it's so highly potent and highly addictive. The same way we've as parents categorized like highly addictive drugs are not safe in any amount. We need to have more of that approach to smartphones and social media. They're not like sugar, something that could be enjoyed in moderation, that even these small amounts of time are really altering how children's brains function and work, and can cumulatively over time lead to divergent brain development. And so it is different in kind, and we need to treat them more like a highly addictive drug.
Now, Claire, a lot of parents are obviously concerned. It does seem like in some ways there's been, especially over the past couple of years, just a significant growing awareness of a lot of these harms. And I think it has given parents pause, either those who have already given their children devices and they're seeing these problems, they want to do some kind of reset, they want to make a change, as well as those who are who have younger children and have the opportunity to set good patterns to begin with. But a lot of them, especially, are thinking in the context of some of these emotional and physical kind of brain effects that relate to just kind of general engagement with screens, with internet, social media. But what are you also seeing? I know you touched on some things that relate to their heart, their soul, but I know it's not an area that you go as deep in
Hmm.
this book that's kind of designed for a wider audience.
Hmm.
But what else are you seeing there that affects parents whose desire is to teach that child to raise them in the fear and admonition of the Lord in discipleship?
Yeah, I would say kind of two categories is that, like I was saying, the design is really meant to cave a child in on themselves, to be very inherently self-focused. And that's why we're seeing these huge spikes in teen anxiety and depression, because just the metrics around these devices and platforms, it makes a child be kind of obsessive in thinking about, what do other people think about me? How much do they value me? And it attaches metrics to that. How many followers do I have, or new messages when I get back on my phone? So I think there's an inherent kind of, the device again is individualized to you, and the algorithm starts to learn what you like. And so there's this caving in on the self instead of learning to lift their eyes up to God and out to others in their community. And so it really, it undermines their kind of ability to think of higher things. And also it's kind of this constant amusement and scrolling and distraction away from eternal matters. They're not thinking about the weightier things in life, because there's no kind of space for solitude and reflection and prayer, which are really important parts of our lives, especially as Christians. And so if they're just constantly amusing and entertaining and distracting themselves away, there's no kind of moments of silence for them to actually think about these deeper questions in life. And then I mentioned the relational piece too. I mean, when you can constantly pull out your phone and turn to your phone for advice, amusement, entertainment, connection, then you're not finding that in the real world with the real people around you. And so in the families I spoke with, they observed, a lot of these families maybe initially had technology and then they gave it up, and they just all observed to me how much it improved their family relationships, because
Mm.
the kids were really so sucked into their devices, they didn't really want to spend time with their parents or their siblings. And so just taking the devices away really strengthened the parent relationship. And I think, a myth I kind of hear from parents is they felt like they were constantly battling their kid, or they're not giving a smartphone. And so they eventually relented into giving the smartphone, because they said, we didn't want all this friction and tension in the relationship. And then they said, but only to learn that giving the smartphone actually only introduced 50 more battles a day. Oh, there are the time limits, the apps, like everything. And so it actually created much more tension and distance in the relationship than if they had just kind of held firm on the smartphone decision. And then the second category that Christians should really pay attention to is, we have to really be aware of the kinds of content kids are accessing on these devices, and not even necessarily intentionally seeking out, but what is fed to them by the algorithms of the main social media platforms and apps that kids are accessing. And it's inherently sexualized, and often very violent and degrading. And so kids are taking this in, and it's becoming normalized to them. And so,
Mm.
I've explained it elsewhere, like it habituates kids toward vice instead of virtue. It celebrates all of this kind of sexual behavior and even normalizes it, that this is normal even among teenagers. And so
Mm.
those two kind of categories I think should be of special concern to Christian parents, just how the addictive design caves children in on themselves, distracting them away from eternal matters, disconnecting them from the real life relationships they were meant to be a part of. God put them in a family. They're born into a family. There's an important role for that. And then the second piece is just that the content celebrated and promoted actively by the platforms really habituates children towards vice and normalizes that, instead of virtue and the kinds of things we'd want to be forming and shaping their character.
It sounds like if we're supposed to have kind of a Deuteronomy 6 mindset of teaching our children and doing that as we walk along the way, and
That's right.
so many of the opportunities throughout life, as well as kind of what seems to be implied in what Paul says in Ephesians about teaching your children, raising them up in the fear and instruction of the Lord. And even in Psalm 78, telling the next generation the glorious deeds of the Lord so that they'll
Hmm.
set their hope in him. That there's both a an effect on the amount of time and life available for that, as well as a kind of an opposing message that's competing with that. Is that what you're seeing here?
Yes. No, I think that's a great summary. And I often reference Deuteronomy 6 when I'm talking to Christian audiences to say, like, this passage assumes like we're spending a lot of relational time with our kids. Like, in order to carry out these commands, like we're connecting. In order to do this, we're passing on the word of the Lord through those relationships, through the meal times and the walks and all the different parts of our days. But if we're all just turning to our devices, well, then that isn't happening. Or if we're just handing a child a device to distract them away so we can get something done, well, then we're not investing in that relationship. So I think definitely to your point, it is both the kind of interrupting of the time and the chance to do that, as well as the way you phrased it, just the fact that, and then the world views held out and promoted to children through these devices are directly opposed to a Christian parent's worldview. And what we're trying to teach our children to love Jesus, to love God, to love and serve others. The message being sent by the social media platforms is you should love yourself. You can be whoever you want to be. You should express yourself. Your parents don't know what's best for you. Like, if they're trying to restrain you, you should just kind of cast them off, disregard them. There's unfortunately this growing movement trending on social media called no contact, where they're basically encouraging kids to sever contact with their parents if they're not affirming, of their new gender identity or other worldview that they've adopted. And so I really want Christian parents to realize it is a very hostile online environment to a Christian worldview. And that gradually over time, those influences can really shape what a child believes. And so we want to be protecting our children from those influences that would be very counter to what we would want them to come to know and believe.
You think about that idea in Psalm 78 about telling the next generation so that they'll hope in God. I'm wondering if kids instead are putting their hope in technology, in their devices, finding that as their go-to for hope, for joy, for security, for identity, um, and maybe even their parents as well.
Yeah, I think that's very true. And I think the other kind of issue with technology is it gives children this sense of independence that I don't really need my parents. I don't really need to listen to my pastor, because with me and the internet, with me and my smartphone, I can kind of take everything on myself. Like, I can figure out what I need to know. I can go to the internet for information. I can kind of use this technology really as like a kind of tool for liberation and independence in ways that, like, we're not independent creatures. Like, we were made to be dependent ultimately on the Lord, but especially as children, to be dependent on our families and to be nurtured and cultivated by our parents. And so I really think it's actually giving children these technologies is kind of thrusting them into the adult world too soon before they're actually mature enough and ready to handle it. It's giving them this sense of adult independence that they're not really ready to operate. They don't have fully formed prefrontal cortexes until age 25, which is what is responsible for our impulse control, our self control, our decision making, our emotional regulation. And so they really truly don't have the tools to be able to navigate this adult world. And they're thrust into a world online that is extremely adult. As I was mentioned, it's very sexualized. And so it's this kind of really sad paradox of the digital age is we're both treating kids almost like they're adults way too early, and they're more underprepared than ever to handle it because the technology itself like undermines their brain's ability to develop those skills, to develop emotional regulation and self-control. And so yes, I'd say to your point, I do think that children entering this online space is really kind of undercutting the parts of childhood that they're really meant to go through with the guidance of a parent.
Mhm. Mhm. So your book is not called Tech Management, it's called Tech Exit. And you, based on what we've been talking about, the concerns you have about controls that are built in, parents' ability to manage a variety of the advice and recommendation that parents have received, why did you go to the degree that you did with Tech Exit?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for asking that question. And I should clarify, because I use the word tech, in the title to kind of signal about what the book is about. But then the subtitle really makes it clear. It's a practical guide to freeing kids and teens from smartphones. And the book explains what the tech exit means is no really interactive screens, no smartphones, no tablets, no video games, no social media until adulthood, or even not in adulthood, but just definitely not during childhood. And in childhood, thinking up to age 18, which I think that position may be a little bit stronger than maybe other things we've heard in the culture, like pledges like wait until eighth.
Mhm.
Eighth grade is not an appropriate time to get a smartphone either. Their brains are still really developing. But what I'm not saying is that we have to make a complete exit from computers and televisions in the same way. So I have a whole chapter about that, which again, those technologies need to be used appropriately, purposefully, publicly in the home because there are certainly dangers to them. But the book is arguing really for a total exit, like a complete opt out from the most addictive interactive screens, which are smartphones, social media, interactive tablets. And it's because of some of that brain research I was discussing that just shows how highly addictive these particular screens are because they're giving kids these constant feedback. A television is kind of a passive screen. You watch a movie or watch a show. The interactive screens of the smartphone, social media apps, it's giving kids constant social feedback, these social rewards. And that is and that is what is highly addictive. And so even in small amounts, as I said, it's releasing these constant dopamine hits and when they're on the app. And so no amount of time really is safe because even if they're only on a certain amount of time per day, it's incredibly addictive. And I spoke with many parents who said they thought, 20 minutes of video games a day for their sons would be okay. But they were like, it completely changed his behavior and personality. And all he wanted to do was game. So even though he was only on it 20 minutes a day, they're like, he didn't want to do anything else. And his personality became really irritable and moody and, upset with us. And so I think it's just important to understand that is why I'm arguing for the total opt out that screen time limits don't work when it comes to addictive technologies. The same way limits don't work when we're talking about an addictive substance. We're not like one cigarette a day is okay. It's like, no, it will be inherently addictive to you. And so that's kind of why I'm saying a total opt out is needed as well as how insufficient the parental controls are to keep up with this app based kind of ecosystem of the smartphone. And so that's kind of the first two chapters of the book, unpacking why the screen time limits and parental controls are not enough. So I kind of make the case then for the total opt out. And then the rest of the book walks you through how to actually do that with step by step plan.
Well, let's give that a quick high level. And I do encourage people to read the book because there are some very helpful details involved in each of these elements. But you set it up in the context of a fast and a feast. Could you give us a high level overview of those two aspects?
Yeah. So I start with fasting because, if you've already given these things to your children, I just want parents to know it's never too late. And as parents, all the time, when we gain new insights or information, we make a change when we learn something is harmful to our kids that we didn't know. So it's never too late to reverse course, but reversing course will look like fasting from these digital screens. And so I kind of walk parents through how to do a 30-day digital detox. There's a real science behind this. Doctors explain that this kind of the 30-day period really actually helps a child's nervous system and
Mm.
brain recalibrate to those kind of normal levels of dopamine, the cortisol and adrenaline that they experience from kind of especially video games that they're in this like state of hyper arousal go back down. They start to feel pleasure in the real world again, and their creativity starts to come back. So I heard from a lot of families, they were so doubtful they'd be able to do a detox. They were like, I just couldn't picture dealing with my child without the screen. And they did find, the first couple days were hard, just like breaking any bad habit. It was an adjustment. But they kept going. And they said, kind of right around when they maybe got into a week and a half to 2 weeks, they started to notice a change where the kids weren't asking for the screens anymore. They were able to play more independently. Their creativity came back. And so they kept going. They made it to the 30 days and then they said, we're never going to go back. I mean, we see these
Mhm.
results in our kids. Why would we go back to giving
Yeah.
them the screens? And so then once you've fasted from digital technologies, you've fasted from this addictive substance, helping your body return to normal, then we feast on real life. And I wanted most of the book to be this positive vision for what it looks like to exit these technologies. It's fundamentally a positive no. I wanted parents to know this isn't a life of like drudgery and restrictions. It's this amazing life of feasting on the real world, embracing real life relationships and pursuits. And so
Mm.
that's what I use. I use feast to summarize kind of the acronym of these 5 kind of core commitments that these families had that helped them sustain this smartphone free childhood lifestyle over the long term. So I'm happy to
As
go
you,
into more detail on
yeah,
the acronym.
as you go into those, where applicable with those, if you have any additional thoughts of where that may even tie into discipleship,
Yeah.
I know that they don't necessarily relate to each of the acronyms. I mean, each of the letters with feast, but where it does, I think that would be helpful
Oh,
as well.
absolutely. No, I'm happy to make that tie-in. And even fasting, fasting is a Christian practice.
Yeah.
It is a habit of grace that we can adopt, and so there is even a biblical kind of root of fasting from things that we know can be distracting to us, and even distracting from, most importantly, our relationship with God. But yeah, just walking through feasts. So F is find other families. And
Mhm.
I think just, we see this just in the Bible. Like God has given us the church, like he has given us a community of believers to walk alongside us. And so I mentioned that in the book, like talking to parents through your church is a great community to start with in terms of trying to find other families to share these convictions so that you aren't the only one, so that you have really allies as parents, but also that your children do actually have friends who also aren't on the smartphones. Because as I try to explain in the book, the harms of these devices are sadly not just individual. They do change the group social dynamics and social environment for kids, even if just a few of their peers are using them. And so it was so helpful to have these kind of collective solutions when parents come together to create these, I call them in the book, counter communities, where we're opting out of the smartphones together. And that makes it really easier on each individual parent, and it starts to kind of push the pressures back out of childhood for screens. So instead of feeling pressured into screens, there's this positive pressure of we're resisting these together, and that can just be really powerful for parents. So I really do recommend talking to other parents at your church, your neighborhood, your school, to find people to do this practice with you. And I do think that is a part of Christian discipleship: is we don't walk the Christian life alone; we walk it with other people, and our technological convictions that are such a critical part of discipling our children is something that we can help each other do together as well. So that I spent a lot of time on that first point because I do think it's the most critical
Yeah.
to being successful is finding other parents to do this with you. And I recommend even reading my book together. I have a discussion guide for that reason that I wrote because I wanted parents to actually be able to read this book and talk about it together so they can come to those convictions in their communities together. And then
Yes.
E is explain, educate, and exemplify. And this probably is the most natural tie into discipleship because this is all about how parents really actually work to explain to their children the reasons for their technological restrictions, and they really work to educate their kids on the digital temptations and harms they're trying to protect them from, because they also recognize their children will be adults, and these digital temptations are not necessarily going away. They could very easily come across these things in adulthood. And so, wanting to actually proactively train and educate our children to know how to kind of turn away from these digital temptations and how to really just be informed themselves about the possible harms they could come across online and understand the motives that parents have in protecting their kids, that they're motivated by their love to try to protect their children. So we're not just kind of handing down these rules and restrictions from on high, but they're in the context of this loving relationship where we're explaining the rationale to our kids. And it doesn't mean they will always accept it, but that they can at least understand where their parents are coming from. And I think I always emphasize, I think this is a really important piece, especially because there's a fear a lot of times around parents that restricting these technologies means my kids will go off and binge later. When they go to college, they'll just go crazy on tech. In all the families I interviewed, that wasn't the case. But they also emphasized to me they did spend a lot of time talking to their children about technology and
Yeah.
explaining why they were doing this. Because I think if you have rules without any explanation, that is a risk that your kids will be kind of fed up with the restrictions and they just want to kind of buck and go the other way. But if they've been really treated as an adult in the sense they've been explained to why we're doing this and trying to actually work to get your kids on board. I know a lot of families mentioned watching documentaries with their teenagers, like The Social Dilemma, which kind of
Yeah.
exposes the business model of social media. And the teens could see for themselves how
Right.
predatory the industry was, and they were just repulsed by it. So I think we do want to, especially as Christian parents, like we are training our children. And I think this is a big part of it, is trying to train them towards wise use of technology. And even saying, when you're an adult, you may choose to get a smartphone. Like, we would really kind of encourage you to wait as long as possible for that decision. But even then, when you do get it, like, these are the ways we want you to think about it. And that's the last part of the E, is exemplify. Because in terms of that kind of fear around binging, I think the other important thing is that we're modeling for ourselves how we want our kids to
Exactly.
use technology when they're adults. And that's convicting. But I think
Yeah.
just knowing our kids see how we use our phones and asking ourselves that we're using our phones the way we would want our children to use them when they are adults, and
Yeah.
having
And you even have some
conversations.
questions in your book about that, right? Of
I
some.
do. I have a self-evaluation at the end in the appendix, which the appendix has a lot of practical resources too, including resources you can use to educate your kids on these harms in age-appropriate ways. Um, and so, yes, there's a kind of self-evaluation, because I do think a lot of this starts with us. Our children will want what we want, they'll value what we value. And so, how we treat our phones will really communicate to our children how they should think about treating their phone when they're an adult. So I would, yeah, that chapter is very rich in terms of
Mhm.
just applications for discipleship, how we can explain, educate, and exemplify the kinds of ways we want our children to wisely handle technology as adults. And it doesn't mean giving them a technology they're not ready for, that's too powerful for them too early. But it does mean training, preparing them, and really exemplifying it ourselves. A is very short. Adopt alternatives. I mainly want to write this chapter so parents would know there are alternatives to smartphones available. Because I get that question a lot. What about when my teenager's driving? They're starting to move around independently on their own. So I just kind of explain, delay the age of first cell phone as long as possible. And then when you do allow a child to have a first phone, adopt an alternative to a smartphone that doesn't have an internet browser or social media apps or gaming apps or really any kind of addictive, distracting element to them. And there are lots of options available that I mentioned in the book. Like
And that's where, yeah, the appendix is priceless with so many of those leads. And I just appreciate too that what you're getting at, there are so many parents who often have good intentions, or there are
yes,
things, there are goods that they have in mind when they give these technologies. And also anytime you start talking about pulling back, they immediately go to, oh, but what about this key thing? And I appreciate that reminder that there's not just one solution, um, and that you don't have to settle for everything that comes with a small slice of helpful tools, to
that's
only
right.
get it in that one package.
That's right. Exactly. So, yeah, I think that's just helpful to remember, that there are better options available. You don't have to kind of cave into the smartphone just because of a specific, communication or even navigation need that a child has. There are better options and tools available. S is setting up digital accountability and family screen time rules. And so this chapter really particularly deals with how to navigate the use of televisions and computers in the home, as well as whenever a child does get a communication channel, maybe it's a first email account for school or a first dumb phone, that there should be no expectation of absolute privacy on the right of that child, that this is really, it's a family device or it's a family communication channel where there's an expectation that the parent can check that if they have a concern, and that accountability is itself the protection. And I think accountability is such a cornerstone of just Christian discipleship, that we need to hold each other accountable. It is protecting us from giving in to temptation or to sin, to have other believers helping to hold us accountable. And while children are in our home, like for parents, we really provide that accountability. And so just wanting children to know that there's no kind of channel of communication that they're going to have that's going to be completely private. And it doesn't necessarily mean a parent is reading every message, but just that there is oversight. And if a parent has a concern, they can access it. And the child just knowing that really is the protection. I had one mom telling me, her son would come tell her, "Mom, you might see something in my email. I don't know why this friend sent this." Like, they were
Yeah,
actually proactive about it, which I think is
good.
exactly what you want. And that opens conversations between parent and child to have that accountability. And then the family screen rules were just that any kind of internet screen use was always public and purposeful. So if the child is doing some type of computer-based assignment, they're going on for that specific purpose, it's in a public place, everyone can observe. And then when they're done, they get off. They're not just surfing the internet. And then screen entertainment was sparing and shared. And so, again, I'm not saying you have to get rid of your television, but it was not a daily habit in these families. Again, because we think about as Christians, what should we be spending our time on? And it's not to say that TV is necessarily inherently evil or anything. It's just that
Yeah.
there are much better things we can be doing with our time on a daily basis, habits we want to be forming in our family. And like, we don't want the TV to be the center of the home. Andy Crouch, in his book, The Tech Wise Family, has a whole principle about this, where the hearth of your home is. Is it a fireplace or a piano or a craft table, or is it the TV? And so just trying to think about what things instead you can shape your family culture around. But instead, if they did use the television, it was for really a specific purpose that was a shared experience together, like a family movie night on a Friday or watching a sport game together on a Saturday, and something that everyone was participating in that's actually helping to bond the family. Not everyone's on their own individual screen. So,
Well, and it sounds like along that line, I think I heard within there, nothing in a kid's bedroom,
oh,
no
yes.
devices there. I was
No.
surprised seeing a stat, looked like it was saying a majority of kids were spending time on devices between midnight and 5 a.m. of teenagers in this one study. And it just seemed shocking that any parent would be surprised that harm would not come out of that.
Yes, no,
Um,
yes, hopefully that was clear in the public and purposeful piece, but there should be no devices in a child's bedroom. Even a dumb phone, when they first get a cell phone, it should have a home outside of that child's bedroom. And honestly, a time limit. I don't think
yeah.
children need to be on even a dumb phone. After 9 p.m., you're like, okay, you're done for the night. Your phone's going to sleep downstairs and you can get it. And I think that public piece too, I will say, even on getting a child a first cell phone, the families I spoke to made it clear, like, this is not your personal device. This is a family device that you are borrowing. And so we are going to set parameters around it. Even for a dumb phone, you're not going to be on it all the time. You're not going to have it on your person all the time. We're going to have this phone box where it mainly lives, so that it's not in your bedroom and it's also not in your pocket all the time. No one needs to be having constant reminders of the presence of their phone on them. So I should have just mentioned that as well, that we, even when you do allow one of those alternatives that I was talking about, there has to be that expectation that it's not their private personal device to take with them whenever, wherever they want, that there are family rules around that. And there's digital accountability set up in the home. So I'll just briefly touch on T, the last
Ah,
letter of the
no, that's
acronym.
an important
I
one.
know we've been going for a while. So T is trade screens for real life responsibilities and pursuits. And I think this chapter got me the most excited, because this is really, especially for Christian and Christian discipleship, this is like thinking positively and proactively about all the good things we want to fill our children's lives and time with instead. And what stood out to me was that these families, it wasn't just hobbies for their kids. It wasn't just here's a bunch of sports and arts and extracurriculars that you're going to be doing, which those things are great. And even play, outdoor play is great, but children need a greater purpose and vision for their lives than just play and extracurriculars. These families were really oriented around service to God and service to others, and starting teaching that in the home through very basic things like chores, but even helping them take on more and more adult like responsibilities in the home. Um, because we want our children to progress towards adulthood. And
That's
ironically, the online world kind of thrusts them into this adult online world, but without the skills and maturity to handle it. And I think these parents, again, were grounded in real life. Like, we are trying to train our children to be mature, self controlled, godly young men and women that will then be prepared for any digital temptations they may face in the adult world. So I do just encourage like giving our kids more gradual responsibility and independence in the real world, oriented towards serving other people, taking their eyes off themselves. And that is just really powerful antidote to the screens. And the screens become less appealing as they really gain that sense of satisfaction for hard work and responsibility to others. And as they engage in these real life relationships and they form really deep friendships with others and with their siblings and with their parents, it makes the online world of all these shallow connections just so much less appealing. So I want to encourage people that that chapter is really rich with just how families have kind of oriented their kids towards the real world and those real life relationships and responsibilities.
Yeah, this is a very valuable vision. Well, Claire, I know as we've been talking that several people have been posting some questions. It's
Yes,
not surprising that this would prompt some questions. So Candace is going to join us now and share some of those questions that we got.
great.
Thanks, Steve. So, Claire, first question for you. What about teens who need an app for work or for school?
Yes. Oh man, I get this question a lot. So I'm going to just say I have a pretty strong answer on this, but I just don't think your decision as a parent to give a child this very powerful technology should feel like you're pressured into that because of some external reason, if that makes sense. Like we were talking about this, Steve, with the alternatives chapter. So I've
Mhm.
seen lots of families handle this differently. Some families, have really just had a conversation with that teacher or coach or employer to explain, like, my child doesn't have a smartphone. We don't want them to have a smartphone. Is there a workaround? Is there another way for them to participate in this activity? Just asking the question and starting a conversation. And honestly, I know that takes bravery and courage to do as a parent, but every parent that does that really makes it easier on the next parent to say, I'd like to opt out too. We don't want our child to have this app to participate in this soccer team. And if you think about it, if you have enough parents who ask that question, well, then the coach is going to decide, okay, I guess we're not doing an app. Like we'll figure out some other way to stay in touch with people. So I don't want to be simplistic about it. I know that that can feel difficult in the moment to kind of have those conversations, but I do think as parents, we really want to just ask ourselves, like, what is the reason I want to give my child this device or not? Like, it really, we are the authority in their lives. We should not feel kind of hand tied into doing something for an external kind of reason. And I would just say some of these alternative phones, they're not a completely minimalist phone. They have certain apps that are tool based. So I know some people, like depending on what the app is, if it's a school thing, those can be accessible via
Mhm.
some of these alternatives. So I would just say it's worth looking into. Even these alternatives might have some of those required apps, but I would just ask about a child being able to use some other means, even like for school. Like I just would the teacher let them borrow a computer to do the app based quiz or activity? Like I just think that we have to kind of see or at least explore if there's a workaround. I know in some situations too, a parent will download an app on their phone, like if it's for a work related employer situation. Just I think just trying to find workarounds. And I go into this a little bit in the book in the chapter Adopt Alternatives and Find Workarounds, where I just say, it's kind of a simple answer, but it just starts by us just rejecting the kind of premise of inevitability of the smartphone and just saying, like, the answer to the problem of having them participate in XYZ thing is not going to be the smartphone. So how can we find another way? And yeah, obviously that will depend on your context, but that would be my recommendation is just at least start with a conversation first to see if there are other ways for your child to participate in those things without the smartphone app.
What about when you have one parent who wants to do a tech exit and the other parent doesn't? I've seen this a lot. Moms particularly feel emotional about this. They get fearful. They say, I'm all about the tech exit. Dad, who maybe likes to play video games with the kids, says, no way. And these are Christian couples, Christian families. What advice do you have when mom and dad are not on the same page about technology?
Ooh, that is a good question. Um, so I actually have had a couple people directly reach out to me and say, what was really helpful is my husband didn't agree with me. And I just asked him if he would read your book. And
Mm.
he did. And he like really came around. And now we've been a tech exit family for like, I forget what she said, 30, 45 days. And she's like, and he even can't believe it, how amazing it is for our kids. And she said it came from this kind of sentimental place where her husband had grown up watching a lot of TV shows with his dad. And so he wanted to do that with his kids, like play video games, watch TV. And so I think, but he became convinced by like the arguments in the book and by her just kind of asking him, like, could we just try it out for 30 days? So that's the main advice I would give is just kind of having a conversation saying, okay, we may not be on the same page, but would you just, indulge me and just read this book? Just try to understand the rationale where I'm coming from. And we could have a conversation about it. Or just at the minimum, just saying, like, would you just be willing to try out a digital detox for 30 days? Like, I'm not going to lock you into this long term. Like, I want to be on the same page, but I really want to try this out. I want to see if it's going to make a difference for our kids. And I've just seen more success in just in starting small with just a very tangible kind of like, let's just try this out and see how it goes, as a way to kind of help get a spouse on board. And I talk about that a little bit in the detox chapter that your spouse does not have to be on the exact same place as you to do a detox, but you just need to get their buy-in to say, okay, I'll be on board. I'll be a team player to do this detox, and then we'll see. So I would just try to say, start with something really practical and tangible to say, could you at least just help me and our family just do this detox and see? Yeah. And then asking them if they'd be willing, like if they're not on the same page, to consider your viewpoint by just reading some materials that you're reading. And I had another mom mention that in during the detox, she was like giving her husband pages of these kind of things to read, like, okay, read this. And I think a lot of it, the disagreement can just come from, I don't want to say a place of ignorance, but just one spouse is more informed than the other. And so they are just going to have different opinions because one spouse has spent all this time reading all the research on how harmful these things are, and the other spouse is just not as aware. And so I would say sometimes just like kind of bridging that knowledge gap in a loving way, just asking them, would you read and kind of see these things I'm reading? This is where I'm coming from as to why I want to do it, because I've read this and I became convinced. Like, would you at least read it and see what you think? I think can be helpful.
One thing that stands out to me is how respectful you sound and how you would present that to a husband, assuming it's a break that way. And I think
Yeah.
that's really important. I would encourage too, and I know you didn't get into this in the book because it's a mainstream book, but it's so vital for spouses to pray together for God's will, and to wives, if your husband is not on board, the Lord is for your marriage and wants you to be one. And so praying that God would make you one in your marriage is praying a prayer he wants to answer. And I have seen wives come back and say, my husband wasn't open and I prayed a long time in some cases, but the Lord can work wonders. So,
That is such a good point. Yes. Yes.
Yeah.
um,
Definitely prayer.
yeah. Is it possible, someone is asking, is it possible to overprotect kids?
Wow. Okay, I feel like that's complicated. I would say personally in the digital world, no. I really don't think it's possible to overprotect them. And one reason, and this is why also I talk about the importance of educating and explaining, is that we are in such a smartphone dominant culture, that my greatest fear is not that my kids are going to see something on a screen in our house, but that a friend is going to pull up a smartphone and show them pornography. And so I don't think it's possible to overprotect them because of how pervasive the harms are on these digital devices. But we do also need to recognize we have to train them, because I don't know if this is the point you're kind of getting to, but they're not always going to be under our roof. They're not even under our roof all the time as they get older. And we want them to have the skills to know how to handle those digital temptations, those situations. We've used the book Good Pictures, Bad Pictures Junior with our young kids. And then they have a Good Pictures, Bad Pictures, just regular version for older kids, just explaining what bad pictures are and where they could see those and what they can do in response. So I don't think we can err on the side of overprotecting in the digital space. I will caveat that by saying I think some parents may overprotect their children in the real world. And I actually think that there are healthy risks, even like risky play, allowing them to climb a tree that's like a little higher than you'd want them to climb. Because those kinds of risks, and Jonathan Haidt goes into this in his book, The Anxious Generation, those actually help kids progress towards adulthood because they learn their boundaries, they learn the limits of their body. And so I'm not recommending they go out and do completely dangerous and reckless things. Like, of course, we as parents, we have wisdom to know how to protect them from things. But I do think we've seen a parenting kind of shift towards allowing so much freedom in the digital world where there's way more harm, really, than the real world. And then we've kind of sheltered them in the real world, thinking that if they're just inside our house on a screen, they're safer than they're just riding their bike down the street. And I think we need to have a little bit more of like a healthy allowance for some independence and risk taking in the real world, and gradually kind of loosening those reins as they get older and they prove themselves capable of handling different challenges, or points of responsibility as kind of tests for then allowing greater freedom in the real world. So I would say there could be a risk of overprotecting our children from truly just developmentally healthy, like safe, like not completely reckless, but just having some healthy risk in the real world. But in terms of the digital realm, I don't think we can overprotect them too much.
Yeah.
Mm.
Thanks so much for answering those questions from our viewers. So just a question about the book, because we see it behind you on your wall there, strategic. And we think it'd be great for those who are watching to go and get a copy, but maybe you could give them a reason or two. They've already heard all that you've said on our conversation today. What else will they get if they get your book?
Oh, thank you for the question. Yeah, so I wanted it to be like a complete kind of one size fits all package, in the sense that there's other great resources out there documenting all the harms. There's other things on detoxes. I wanted though this to be like a one-stop shop for parents, and especially for them to be able to give to a friend, that kind of quickly summarizes why a smartphone free childhood is necessary, like very briefly with the research, in a way that's digestible to the average parent, that they don't have to have like a very high academic level of understanding to wade through scientific studies, but it's presented in a way that they can grasp. And so that's kind of the first two chapters. But then with all the practical examples and anecdotes, because in all my conversations with parents, it just, in our culture, it can feel impossible to do this. I do think that that culture is starting to change, but I really wanted to show, more than telling, to show people how to do this, like how it's possible, how families have done this, that the challenges may not be as big as they seem. I think a lot of the obstacles we have in our mind as parents, or fears, like the fear of binging that I mentioned. So I really try to take all of those head on in the book, in ways that are really easy for a parent to understand and grasp. And I do briefly address schools and policymakers at the end. So if you have educators or school administrators or principals in your life, I do think there's a lot schools can do to help parents. And so I do address that as well as lawmakers. There are ways we need laws, to be more supportive of parents in opting out. So that's it in a nutshell. And it's not that long. It's a pretty quick read. I think it's pretty easy to read because I do incorporate so many stories and examples and anecdotes. So that would be my sell, is that you can just have this one-stop shop resource for kind of why to do a smartphone free childhood and how to do it. And it's a very easy resource then to hand to another parent that you might be having a conversation with, that you're actually trying to get on board, or a parent who says, we're just struggling with our teen with this smartphone, or we're just struggling. Our kids are just on their tablets all the time. I think that this book doesn't assume the parent or reader reading it is already on the same page. But it actually writes to that kind of moderate parent who is starting to become aware that there's there's harm, but they don't think it's possible to leave it completely behind or exit it. And I'm hoping that this resource then will persuade them to do that. So I've also told parents when they're like, what if you do if you're talking to a parent who like disagrees with you or doesn't think it's possible?" And I said, I would just ask them to read the book and see what they think, because I actually tried to write it for that audience. I wasn't writing it to people who are already convinced or on the same page as me, but I was writing it to people that I was trying to convince. And so, if that's you, if you know someone that you want to help, that you feel like is kind of caught in what I call the screen time trap, this is a book that can help them get out of it. And so it's something that you can just hand as an accessible resource to another parent.
Claire, we are thankful that you wrote the book.
Yes.
I asked all of the moms of my kids' school friends to read the book and then have
Oh,
them all over to talk about it in our living room. So this is that kind of book that can get good conversations started. This has been such a valuable conversation. Thank you for taking so much time out of your day to be with us. We are so grateful and we pray the Lord's blessings on your work. Thank you.
Thank
thank
you,
you
Claire.
so much. Loved joining you all.
Thank you.
Steve, maybe you can tell us what True 78 offers for family discipleships. You put the phones away. What are we going to do in
Yep.
this place?
Yeah, and really that is our heart, is that we do want to equip churches and families, and we know families especially have such a significant opportunity and responsibility to disciple their children, and that it can really be helpful to have books that are giving them a vision for discipleship, as well as books that help them to uh, guide their children in learning about the Bible, whether in a devotional format or a children's story Bible. And so we just encourage people to go to Truth 78, and especially under the family area. And I believe there's a link that's being provided for that. We want them to find, especially, a lot of resources that are freely available. But we also want to extend an offer. We have a resource, a subscription called Truth 78 Plus Family. And for the next month or so, we are offering a discount on that, 25% off if people will use FAM Plus 25. And even though this is a kind of a digital delivered service, it has a library of some digital resources and an email that goes out. It is something that can be very much used within the philosophy of a tech exit, and it also includes a discount, 25% discount on resources, print resources ordered for discipleship. And we do hope this would be a great resource for families who are uh, wanting to replace so much digital engagement with solid discipleship.
Thanks, Steve. Would you close our time in prayer?
Yeah, let's do that. Let's pray. Oh Lord, you've called us to tell the next generation your glorious deeds and to raise them in the fear and instruction of you. And you know the world you've called us to do that in. With all the technology that's shaping children in this generation, and even the new technology that will be emerging in the years ahead of us. So we pray you'll give us wisdom and help us to be faithful. Lord, thank you for this message you've put on Clare Morell's heart. Lord, bless her in this work, and also in how she and her husband are living it out in their family. And Lord, we pray for all the families represented in this webinar, those who will be watching this video later. Lord, may you guide them in discipleship as they walk along the way with their children and in their times of family worship. Lord, help them to guide their children with their affection, their example, their teaching. Lord, that you empower by your Spirit. And Lord, may you work mightily through your word as these parents teach it to their children. Lord, give their children eyes to see and to treasure you, and give them new hearts that hope in you. And now unto him who is able to do far more abundantly than all we ask or think, according to the power at work within us, to him be the glory in our homes, in the church, and in Christ Jesus, to all generations, forever and ever. Amen.
Thanks, Steve. We are here to serve you. If you have any questions and want to follow up, please just reach out to us at info@truth78.org. And just a quick announcement before we sign off, our next webinar will be on November 18th. This will be a special event with Shai and Blair Lynn. We'll be talking about family worship and discipleship. And so we hope that you'll join us on the 18th of November. You'll get details about that in your email. Thanks so much for joining us today, and we hope to see you again soon. Bye-bye.